Chapter 14. The Socialistic Teaching of the Young Islanders, the Thinkers, and the Workers. What do ye at our door? Ye guard our master's granaries from the thin hands of the poor. Lady Wilde, Speranza. God of justice, I cried, send thy spirit down on those lords so cruel and proud. Soften their hearts and relax their frown, or else, I cried aloud, vouchsafe strength to the peasant's hand to drive them at length from out the land. Thomas Davis. We have pointed out that the young island chiefs who had so fervently declaimed about the revolution were utterly incapable of accepting it when at last it presented itself to them. Indeed, Daucheny uses that very word in describing the scenes at Cashel. It was the revolution, he said, if we had accepted it. We might with perfect justice apply to these brilliant but unfortunate men the words of another writer, Louis Sagueret, in describing a similar class of leaders in France, and say, quote, having all their life sung the glories of the revolution, when it rose up before them, they ran away appalled, like the Arab fisher at the apparition of the genie. End of quote. To the average historian who treats of the relations between Ireland and England as of a struggle between two nations, without any understanding of the economic conditions or of the great world movements which caught both countries in their grasp, the hesitancy and vacillation of the young island chiefs in the crisis of their country's fate constitutes an insoluble problem, and has too often been used to point a sneer at Irishmen when the writer was English, or to justify a sickening apology when the writer was Irish. Neither action is at all warranted. The simple fact is that the Irish workers in town and country were ready and willing to revolt, and that the English government of the time was saved from serious danger only by the fact that Smith O'Brien and those who patterned after him dreaded to trust the nation to the passion of the so-called lower classes. Had rebellion broken out at the time in Ireland, the English Chartists, who had been arming and preparing for a similar purpose, would, as indeed Mitchell pointed out continually in his paper, have seized the occasion to take the field also. Many regiments of the English army were also honeycombed with revolt, and had repeatedly shown their spirit by publicly cheering for the Irish and Chartist cause. An English leader of the Chartists, John Frost, was sentenced to a heavy term of transportation for his seditious utterances at this time, and another great English champion of the working class, Ernest Jones, in commenting upon the case, declared defiantly in a public meeting that, quote, the time would come when John Mitchell and John Frost would be brought back and Lord John Russell sent to take their place, and the green flag would fly in triumph over Downing Street and Dublin Castle. Downing Street was the residence of the English Prime Minister. For ushering this sentiment, Ernest Jones was arrested and sentenced to 12 months' imprisonment. In their attitude towards all manifestation of working-class revolt in England, the Young Islanders were sorely divided. In his paper, The United Irishman, John Mitchell hailed it exultantly as an aid to Ireland, and as a presage of the victory of real democracy, setting aside a large portion of his space in every issue to chronicle the progress of the cause of the people in England. His attitude in this matter was one of the most potent causes of his enduring popularity amongst the masses. On the other hand, the section of the Young Islanders who had made Smith O'Brien their idol for no other discoverable reason than the fact that he was rich and most respectable, strove by every means in their power to disassociate the cause of Ireland from the cause of democracy. A wordy war between Mitchell and his critics ensued, each side appealing to the precedent of 1798, with the result that Mitchell was easily able to prove that the revolutionists of that period, notably Wolfe Tone, had not only allied the cause of Ireland with the cause of democracy in general, but had vehemently insisted upon the necessity of a social revolution in Ireland at the expense of the landed aristocracy. Copying Fintan Lalla, Mitchell made the principles involved in those ideals the slogans of his revolutionary campaign. He insisted, correctly, upon a social insurrection as the only possible basis for a national revolution. that the same insurrectionary upheaval that destroyed and ended the social subjection of the producing classes would end the hateful foreign tyranny reared upon it. Two passages from his writings are especially useful as bearing out and attesting his position on those points that are still the fiercest subjects of dispute in Ireland. In his letter to the farmers of Ireland, March 4th, 1848, he says, quote, "But I am told it is in vain to speak thus to you, that the peace policy of O'Connell is dearer to you than life and honour, that many of your clergy, too, exhort you to die rather than violate what the English call law, and that you are resolved to take their bidding. Then die in your patience and perseverance, but be well assured of this, that the priest who bids you perish patiently amidst your own golden harvest preaches the gospel of England, insults manhood and common sense, bears false witness against religion, and blasphemes the providence of God." End of quote. When the Republican government, which came into power in Paris after the Revolution of February 1848, recognizing that it owed its existence to the armed working men, and that those workers were demanding some security for their own class as a recompense for their bloody toil, enacted a law guaranteeing the right to work to all, and pledging the credit of the nation to secure that right. Mitchell joyfully hailed that law as an indication that the absurd theories of what he rightfully styled the English system, or capitalism, had no longer a hold upon the minds of the French people. We quote a portion of that article. Our readers will note that the free trade referred to is free trade in labour as against state protection of the rights of the workers. Quote, "Dynasties and thrones are not half so important as workshops, farms, and factories. Rather, we may say that dynasties and thrones, and even provisional governments, are good for anything exactly in proportion as they secure fair play, justice, and freedom to those who labour. It is here that France is really ahead of all the world. The great Third Revolution has overthrown the enlightened pedantic political economy, what we know in Ireland as the English political economy, or the famine political economy, and has established once and for all the true and old principles of protection to labour, and the right and duty of combination among workmen by a decree of the Provisional Government dated February the 25th. Quote, "It engages to guarantee work to all citizens. It recognises the right of workmen to combine for the purpose of enjoying the lawful proceeds of their labour." End of quote. The French Republicans do not, like ignorant and barbarous English Whigs, recognise a right to pauper relief and make it a premium upon idleness. They know that man has a charter to eat bread in the sweat of his brow and not otherwise, and they acknowledge that highest and most sacred mission of government, to take care that bread may be had for the earning. For this reason they expressly and in set terms renounce competition and free trade, in the sense in which an English Whig uses these words, and deliberately adopt combination and protection, that the nation should combine to protect by laws its own national industry, and that individuals should combine with other individuals to protect by trades associations the several branches of national industry. The free trade and competition, in other words, the English system, is pretty well understood by now. Its obvious purpose and effect are to make the rich richer and the poor poorer, to make capital the absolute ruler of the world, and labour a blind and helpless slave. By free trade, the manufacturers of Manchester are enabled to clothe India, China, and South America, and the artisans of Manchester can barely keep themselves covered from the cold. By dint of free trade, Belfast grows more linen cloth than it ever did before, but the men who weave it have hardly a shirt to their back. Free trade fills with corn the stores of speculating capitalists, but leave those who have sown and reaped the corn without a meal. Free trade unpeoples villages and peoples poorhouses, consolidates farms and gluts the graveyards with famished corpses. There is to be no more of this free trade in France. Men can no longer do what they like with their own there. February 1848 came, and the pretext of the Reform Banquet. Again, Paris had her 3 days' agony and was delivered of her third and fairest-born revolution. There could be no mistake this time. The rubbish of thrones and dynasties is swept out forever, and the people sit sovereign in the land. One of their first and greatest acts is the enactment of a commission to inquire into the whole of the great labour question, and to all the documents issued by this commission appear signed the names of Louis Blanc and the insurgent of Lyon, Albert Ouvrier, workman. He is not ashamed of his title, though now a great officer of the state. He is a working man and is proud of it, quote, in any bond, bill, quittance, or obligation, end of quote. 60 years ago, the farmers of France had their revolution. 18 years ago, the respectable middle classes had theirs, and have made a good penny in it since, but upon this third and last, all the world may see the stamp and impress of the man who made it, Albert Ouvrier, his mark. We have all 3 revolutions to accomplish, and the sooner we set about it, the better. Only let us hope all the work may be done in one. Let not the lessons of history be utterly useless. The detestable system of free trade and fair competition, which is described by Louis Blanc as that specious system of leaving unrestricted all pecuniary dealings between man and man, which leaves the poor man at the mercy of the rich, and promises to cupidity that waits its time, an easy victory over hunger that cannot wait. The system that seeks to make mammon and not God or justice rule this world. In one word, the English or famine system must be abolished utterly, in farms or workshops, in town and country, abolished utterly. And to do this were worth 3 revolutions, or 3 times 3. End of quote. So wrote Mitchell when, burning with a holy hatred of tyranny, he poured the vitriol of his scorn upon the pedants who strutted around him, pedants who were as scrupulous in polishing a phrase for a lecture as a sword for a parade, and incapable of advancing beyond either. His joy was, we now know, somewhat premature, as the government which passed the law was itself a capitalistic government, and as soon as it found itself strong enough and had won over the army, repealed its own law and suppressed, with the most frightful bloodshed, the June insurrection of the workmen striving to enforce its fulfilment. It is the latter insurrection which Mitchell denounces in his jail journal, when, led astray by the garbled reports of English newspapers, he anathematizes the very men who he had in this article, when fuller sources of information were available, courageously and justly praised. But another revolutionist, Devon Riley, in The Irish Felon, more correctly appraised the position of the June insurgents, and also appreciated the fact that Ireland, for its redemption, required something more far-reaching, something sounding deeper springs of human action, something more akin to the teachings that inspired the heroic workers of France than was to be found in the personal probity or aristocratic descent or eminent respectability of a few leaders. When Mitchell was arrested and his paper suppressed, 2 other papers sprang up to take the post of danger, thus left vacant. One, the Irish Tribune, represented the element which stood for the moral right of insurrection, and the other, the Irish Felon, embodied the ideas of those who insisted that the English conquest of Ireland was twofold, social or economic, and political, and that, therefore, the revolution must also have these 2 aspects. These latter were at all times in the fullest sympathy with the movements of the working-class democracy at home and abroad. John Martin edited The Irish Felon. James Finton Lalla and Devon Riley were its chief writers. Riley, who hailed originally from Monaghan, had long been a close observer of, and sympathizer with, the movements of the working class, and all schemes of social redemption. As a writer on The Nation newspaper, he had contributed a series of articles on the great French socialist Louis Blanc in a review of his great work 10 ans, 10 years, in which, while dissenting from the, quote, state socialistic schemes of social regeneration favoured by Blanc, he yet showed the keenest appreciation of the gravity and universality of the social question, as well as grasping the innate heroism and sublimity of the working-class movement. This attitude he preserved to the last of his days. When in exile in America after the insurrection, he was chosen by the printers of Boston to edit a paper, the Protective Union they had founded on cooperative principles, to advocate the rights of labour, and was thus one of the first pioneers of labour journalism in the United States, a proud and fitting position for a true Irish revolutionist. As writer in the American Review, he wrote a series of articles on the European situation, of which Horace Greeley said that, if collected and published as a book, they would create a revolution in Europe. Commenting upon the uprising in France in June, he says in the Irish Felon, quote, "We are not communists. We abhor communism for the same reason we abhor poor law systems, and systems founded on the absolute sovereignty of wealth. Communism destroys the independence and dignity of labour, makes the working man a state pauper, and takes his manhood from him. But communism or no communism, these 70,000 workmen had a clear right to existence. They had the best right to existence of any men in France, and if they could have asserted their right by force of arms, they would have been fully justified. The social system in which a man willing to work is compelled to starve is a blasphemy, an anarchy, and no system. For the present, these victims of monarchic rule, disowned by the Republic, are conquered. 10,000 are slain, 20,000 perhaps doomed to the Marquesas. But for all that, the rights of labour are not conquered, and will not and cannot be conquered. Again and again the labourer will rise up against the idler. The working men will meet this bourgeoisie and grapple and war with them till their equality is established, not in word, but in fact." End of quote. This was the spirit of the men grouped around the Irish Felon, its editor alone excepted. Students of socialism will recognise that many who are earnest workers for socialism today would, like Devon Riley, have abhorred the crude communism of 1848. The fact that he insisted upon the unqualified right of the working class to work out its own salvation, by force of arms if necessary, is what entitles Devon Riley to a high place of honour in the estimation of the militant proletariat of Ireland. The opening passage in an address of the medical students of Dublin to all Irish students of science and art, adopted at a meeting held in Northumberland Buildings, Eden Quay, on April 4, 1848, and signed by John Savage as chairman and Richard Dalton Williams as secretary, shows also that amongst the educated young men of that generation, there was a general recognition of the fact that the struggle of Ireland against her oppressors was naturally linked with, and ought to be taken in conjunction with, the worldwide movement of the democracy. It says, quote, "A war is waging at this hour all over Europe, between intelligence and labour on the one side, and despotism and force on the other." End of quote. A sentiment which Joseph Brennan versified in a poem on divine right, in which the excellence of the sentiment must be held to atone for the poverty of the poetry. One verse says, quote, "The only right acknowledged by the people living now is the right to obtain honour by the sweat of brain and brow, the right divine of labour to be first of earthly things, that the thinker and the worker are manhood's only kings." End of quote. But the palm of honour for the clearest exposition of the doctrine of revolution, social and political, must be given to James Fintan Lalla of Tenakill, Queen's County. Lalla unfortunately suffered from a slight physical disability which incapacitated him from attaining to any leadership other than intellectual, a fact that, in such a time and amidst such people, was fatal to his immediate influence. Yet in his writings as we study them today, we find principles of action and of society which have within them not only the best plan of campaign suited for the needs of a country seeking its freedom through insurrection against a dominant nation, but also held the seeds of the more perfect social peace of the future. All his writings at this period are so illuminating that we find it difficult to select from the mass any particular passages which more deserve reproduction than others, but as an indication of the line of argument pursued by this peerless thinker, and as a welcome contrast to the paralysing respect, nay, reverence for landlordism evidenced by Smith O'Brien and his worshippers, perhaps the following passages will serve. In an article entitled The Faith of a Felon, published July 8, 1848, he tells how he had striven to convert the Irish Confederation to his views and failed, and says, quote, "They wanted an alliance with the landowners. They chose to consider them as Irishmen and imagined that they could induce them to hoist the green flag. They wished to preserve an aristocracy. They desired not a democratic, but merely a national revolution. Had the Confederation, in the May or June of 47, thrown heart and mind and means into the movement, I pointed out they would have made it successful and settled at once and forever all questions between us and England. The opinions I then stated, and which I yet stand firm to, are these. 1. That in order to save their own lives, the occupying tenants of the soil of Ireland ought, next autumn, to refuse all rent and arrears of rent then due, beyond and except the value of the overplus of harvest produce remaining in their hands, after having deducted and reserved a due and full provision for their own subsistence during the next ensuing 12 months. 2. That they ought to refuse and resist being made beggars, landless and homeless under the English law of ejection. 3. That they ought, further, on principle, to refuse all rent to the present usurping proprietors, until the people, the true proprietors, or lords paramount in legal parlance, have in national congress or convention decided what rents they are to pay and to whom they are to pay them. 4. And that the people, on grounds of policy and economy, ought to decide, as a general rule when admitting of reservations, that these rents shall be paid to themselves, the people, for public purposes, and for behoof and benefit of them, the entire general people. It has been said to me that such a war on the principles I propose would be looked on with detestation by Europe. I assert the contrary. I say such a war would propagate itself throughout Europe. Mark the words of this prophecy. The principle I propound goes to the foundations of Europe, and sooner or later will cause Europe to outrise. Mankind will yet be masters of the earth. The right of the people to make the laws. This produced the first great modern earthquake, whose latent shocks, even now, are heaving in the heart of the world. The right of the people to own their land. This will produce the next. Train your hands and your sons' hands, gentlemen of the earth, for you and they will yet have to use them. End of quote. The paragraph is significant as demonstrating that Fintan Lalla, like all the really dangerous revolutionists of Ireland, advocated his principles as part of the creed of the democracy of the world, and not merely as applicable only to the incidents of the struggle of Ireland against England. But this latter is the interpretation which the middle-class politicians and historians of Ireland have endeavoured to give his teachings after the failure of their attempt, continued for half a century, to ignore or suppress all reference to his contribution to Irish revolutionary literature. The working-class democracy of Ireland will, it is to be hoped, be, for their part, as assertive of the universality of Lalla's sympathies as their bourgeois compatriots are in denying it. That working class would be uselessly acquiescing in the smirching of its own record, were it to permit emasculation of the message of this Irish apostle of revolutionary socialism, and in emphasizing the Catholicity of his sympathies, as well as the keenness of his insight into the social structure, that Irish working class will do well to confront the apostate patriotism of the politicians and anti-socialists of Ireland with the following brilliant passage from the work already quoted, and thus show how Lalla answered the plea of those who begged him to moderate or modify his position, to preach it as a necessity of Ireland's then desperate condition, and not as a universal principle. Quote, I attest and urge the plea of utter and desperate necessity to fortify her, Ireland's, claim, but not to found it. I rest it on no temporary and passing conditions, but on principles that are permanent and imperishable and universal, available to all times and to all countries as well as to our own. I pierce through the upper stratum of occasional and shifting circumstances to bottom and base on the rock below. I put the question in its eternal form, the form in which, how often so ever suppressed for a season, it can never be finally subdued, but will remain and return, outliving and outlasting the cowardice and corruption of generations. I view it as ages will view it, not through the mist of a famine, but by the living lights of the firmament. By such lights, the teachings of Fintan Lala are being viewed today, with the result that, as he recedes from us in time, his grandeur as a thinker is more and more recognized. His form rises clearer and more distinct to our view, as the forms of the petty agitators and phrase-mongering rebels who seem to dominate the scene at that historic period sink into their proper place, as unconscious factors in the British imperial plan of conquest by famine. Cursed by the fatal gift of eloquence, our Irish Girondins of the Confederation enthralled the Irish people and intoxicated themselves out of the possibility of serious thinking. Drunken with words, they failed to realize that the ideas originating with Fintan Lala, and in part adopted and expounded with such dramatic power by Mitchell, were a more serious menace to the hated power of England than any that the dream of a union of classes could ever materialize on Irish soil. The bones of the famine victims, whitening on every Irish hill and valley, or tossing on every wave of the Atlantic, were the price Ireland paid for the eloquence of its rebels, and their scornful rejection of the socialistic teachings of its thinkers.